Originally, I planned to start this video by quoting famous people's opinions on Nietzsche, hoping to lure you into spending an hour of your time to listen to the story of his life. However, after gathering information about Nietzsche's life, I realized that, just like Nietzsche before his descent into madness, when he was still sane, he desperately wanted his ideas to be recognized. Yet, reality was always so cruel. At that time, his best-selling book sold only 600 copies, and now, his most famous work had sold just 40 copies. So, I'm not trying to entice you to learn about this philosopher, but if you have even the slightest willingness, let's delve into the life of Nietzsche, one that is both infinitely lonely and infinitely rich. Nietzsche's full name was Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, born on October 15, 1844, in the village of Rachen, located in the Kingdom of Prussia's Saxony region. This village is in present-day Saxony-Anhalt, Germany. Nietzsche's family was closely tied to religion. His father, grandfather, great-grandfather, maternal grandfather, and great-grandfather were all devout Lutheran pastors, and his mother was a devout Christian as well. Nietzsche had one sister and two brothers. Nietzsche's father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a pastor who, in his youth, excelled and earned the admiration and support of King Frederick William IV of Prussia. However, due to illnesses such as headaches, Nietzsche's father had to rest frequently, which hindered his career advancement. Eventually, Nietzsche's father secured a position in Rachen, and the family moved there. Rachen was a poor, desolate village in Saxony, but for Nietzsche's ailing father, it was an ideal place for recuperation. Nietzsche's father was also musically talented and would play the organ at the village church every evening. Nietzsche's mother, Franziska Aller, was a gentle, kind, and compassionate woman. Her maternal love and care gave Nietzsche a sense of warmth and security at home. Throughout Nietzsche's upbringing, his mother was his strongest pillar of support. When Nietzsche was 4 years old, his father fell down the steps outside their home and hit his head. This incident, along with his pre-existing headaches and neurotic conditions, caused him to lose his sanity. A year later, when Nietzsche was just over 5, his father passed away. Nietzsche's father was a serious, responsible, and passionate person who placed great emphasis on education. He encouraged Nietzsche to study hard and develop independent thinking. This educational approach instilled in Nietzsche a thirst for knowledge and deep contemplation from a young age. However, Nietzsche's relationship with his father wasn't always harmonious, as the pressure from his father's strict expectations greatly affected his mental health. As an adult, Nietzsche often expressed complex feelings about his father in his works, feelings of respect and gratitude, as well as dissatisfaction and rebellion. The loss of Nietzsche's father was a tremendous blow to young Nietzsche, forcing him to confront the reality of death and the fragility of life at such an early age. Not long after his father's death, Nietzsche had a dream in which he heard the sound of an organ at his father's funeral. Then he saw his father rise from the grave, walk into the church, and leave again, holding a child in his arms, returning to the grave. The next day, Nietzsche shared this dream with his mother, initially thinking it was just a strange dream. However, not long after, Nietzsche's youngest brother, Joseph, fell ill and, just a few hours later, passed away, joining their father in the grave. Everything seemed to align eerily with the dream Nietzsche had. After experiencing the second loss of a loved one, the entire family was plunged into deep sorrow. During this time, they fell into a pessimistic way of living. As Nietzsche wrote, after the death of his father and brother, they held no expectations for life, with God and heaven being their only comforts and hopes for survival. Soon after, when Nietzsche was 6 years old, the family moved to the small town of Naumburg by the Saale River, where his grandmother and aunt also relocated. Although it was a crowded living situation, being together helped the family gradually overcome their grief. Naumburg was a rigid and strict city governed by bureaucrats and pastors. Though Nietzsche was just a child, he quickly adapted to life there, and his life became as structured and disciplined as the city itself. Young Nietzsche's natural curiosity led him to discover the beauty in his new life. There were grand military parades, organ music, and religious ceremonies. Nietzsche eagerly awaited Christmas each year to experience the lively and grand holiday celebrations. Young Nietzsche deeply missed his father and had internalized the idea of becoming a pastor like his father and ancestors, to spread the word of God. Despite his youth, he displayed a strict, disciplined nature and set high standards for himself. The smallest rebuke would deeply hurt his pride. He liked to act alone and would retreat into corners to reflect when anxious. One day, he walked home alone in a heavy downpour. His mother noticed he didn't have an umbrella and asked why he wasn't rushing home. He calmly responded that his teacher had told him not to run in the street. His peers called him the little pastor. Every time he read the Bible aloud, his classmates listened intently with respect and reverence. Nietzsche often told his sister that only when one becomes the master of oneself can they become the master of the world. Nietzsche's grandmother enjoyed telling stories of the family's legendary history, which fueled Nietzsche's and his sister's imaginations about their family's past. She spoke of their ancestor, the Polish Count Nietzsche, who had resisted religious persecution and broken ties with the Catholic Church. The ancestor began a difficult journey of wandering, enduring hardship, but eventually overcame adversity, passing down through the generations. Young Nietzsche believed this with all his heart, confident that the Nietzsche family had noble blood, which made him hold his reputation in high regard and filled him with pride. By the age of 9, Nietzsche's interest began to expand. After hearing Handel's choral music in church, music opened a window to the world of sound for him. He began learning to play the piano, improvising freely, and even accompanying Bible readings. Nietzsche's exceptional talents made his mother anxious, reminding her of her late husband, and she feared her son might face the same unfortunate fate as his father. After finishing primary school, Nietzsche entered the middle school in Naumburg, where his astonishing talent and intelligence became evident. Teachers recommended his mother send him to a higher quality school. However, she hesitated and preferred to keep him close, rejecting their advice. At the age of 14, near the end of his middle school years, Nietzsche spent an unusual vacation. As usual, he chose to vacation in the countryside, where the trees were lush and the hills rolling, and the village sat beside the Saale River. Every morning, Nietzsche would bathe in the clear river water. During this time, Nietzsche lived with his grandparents and his sister, feeling content with this fulfilling daily life. Yet, even as a young boy, he began to worry about the future. Nietzsche felt that, as he grew older and was about to embark on adulthood, he would have to leave his family and make new friends in unfamiliar places. He felt a certain anxiety about the unknown path ahead. He recalled his childhood and innocence, believing no one should mock these memories. In the 13 years that had passed, through his father's love and the loss of family members, through pride, family legends, and a search for music and poetry, these scenes flooded Nietzsche's mind. Suddenly, he became intoxicated with the richness of his life and, taking up a pen, completed an autobiography in just 12 days. After finishing the memoir, he felt immense joy writing. In the process of writing, great joy filled my heart, and I felt no fatigue. Reflecting on my early years and the development of my soul was truly meaningful. The 14-year-old Nietzsche, after the holiday ended, finally achieved his wish of attending the Förster School. Förster was a school with a long history, where students were taught literature and moral discipline. From the moment Nietzsche entered, he did not display any remarkable feats for the most part, but there was one event that became a subject of much discussion. It occurred during his first year, when he questioned the story of Mucius Scaevola. His classmates doubted the authenticity of the tale, thinking no one would dare to thrust their hand into the fire. Nietzsche did not argue with them. Instead, he reached into the stove, pulled out a burning coal, and placed it in his palm, leaving a scar. This scar remained with him for life. To preserve this honor, Nietzsche even dripped melted wax onto the scar to make it more visible. Adapting to this new life was challenging for Nietzsche, and it took him a long time to adjust. He was not much for socializing, preferring to be alone and not easily engaging with strangers. His gentle nature made it hard for him to adapt to the school's strict rules. At the age of 15, Förster granted students a one-month holiday. Nietzsche took this rare opportunity to revisit his hometown and briefly traveled to Jena and Weimar. The year had mostly been consumed with studies, leaving little room for creative writing. Now, with his inspiration rekindled, he wrote an essay about his summer travels, tinged with a sense of melancholy. Although only 15, the young Nietzsche's essay already reflected his introspective questions about suffering and the soul. He wrote, "The scent of flowers is still there, along with the crimson glow of the evening sky. Don't you feel your thoughts soaring, like a skylark singing its heart out, perched on the golden clouds? Look at the grandeur of this night, as my life unfolds before me. My fate is thus arranged. In the dark shadows, part of it is enclosed, while the rest ascends into the free air." At that very moment, a sharp scream came from the insane asylum by the road, tearing at our ears. It felt as if some demon was flapping its evil wings, touching our skin, so we gripped our hands tighter. Away with you, wicked force. Even in this beautiful world, there are still tormented souls. But what then is suffering? When the holiday ended, Nietzsche returned to school. The days after the new term began were filled with boredom and disillusionment. Then one day, while reading, Nietzsche gradually discovered his passion and interests. He devised an extensive study plan, combining geology, botany, astronomy, Latin readings, Hebrew, military science, and various skills. He believed that religion should be the main focus of his studies, as it was the foundation of all knowledge. The pursuit of truth, he thought, was endless. Through diligent study, winter and spring passed quickly, and Nietzsche spent his second short holiday before returning to school. When autumn arrived, the massive oak trees on the Forta campus lost their former green. At 17, Nietzsche felt a deep sadness inside. After a long period of living under pressure, he found it painful to comply with others. He read works by Schiller, Hölderlin, and Byron, and dreamed of ancient Greek gods, especially the gloomy and powerful sorcerer Manfred. Manfred struggled with his sense of authority, seeking peace in death, but realizing that his art had bound him to life. Nietzsche began to grow weary of school life and expressed his desires to his mother and sister. He wanted to become a musician and escape the school. His mother calmed his agitation, but then, suddenly, his favorite teacher at school passed away, throwing him into confusion again. Nietzsche started avoiding his studies, distancing himself from others, and immersing himself in meditation. He recorded his inner unease, examining the conflict between romanticism and cold scientific systems. Although he questioned religion, he still maintained a devout faith. Even as his religious beliefs weakened, he struggled between remaining within the bounds of his faith and embracing a new one, feeling intense pressure. During this period, Nietzsche deeply admired the works of Schiller, Byron, and Hölderlin, especially the latter. Hölderlin, who had already passed away, was not well known at the time. He was a pioneer of classical romanticism, whose work would only be recognized decades after his death. But the less than 18-year-old Nietzsche, with a keen eye, was drawn to his work. Hölderlin had retreated to his hometown, struggling with his creative journey, but met with public indifference. His works brought Greek mythology into German literature, attempting to bridge ancient Greece with contemporary Germany. Despite his immense talent, Hölderlin became deeply melancholic. Nietzsche thus spent his school years immersed in reading. In 1862, at the age of 18, Nietzsche left Naumburg and headed for the University of Bonn to begin his university life. Nietzsche was full of anticipation for this new phase. As he wrote, "I arrived in Bonn, seeing the infinite beauty of a landscape, and I felt proud of everything." At this time, Nietzsche was eager to make new friends, hoping to learn together and influence each other's thoughts. At the university, where group study was prevalent, Nietzsche, though reluctant to give up his independence, eventually joined a student association at Bonn University. He wrote, "This decision of mine to take this step was made after much thought. I gave up my individuality because I knew I would gain more after doing so." In the following weeks, Nietzsche tried to adapt to his new life. While maintaining a disciplined lifestyle, he avoided smoking and drinking, finding joy in academic discussions and rowing. He enjoyed dining at a riverside restaurant, singing with friends on the way home in the evenings, and immersing himself in this lifestyle. To become what was considered a proper student at the time, he even contemplated challenging someone to a duel. However, not long after, Nietzsche grew weary of his life, and his happiness gradually faded. With the arrival of December, his social activities dwindled, and he sank back into old worries, feeling increasingly isolated. Nietzsche's mood grew even gloomier during Christmas and New Year. He was dissatisfied with how he had spent his time and decided to live more rigorously and with more focus. However, this decision meant severing ties with his companions, which left him torn. Though his friends were young and courageous, Nietzsche found their behavior crude, making it difficult to make a decision. He had initially considered adapting to their rough lifestyle to alleviate his overly sensitive discomfort, but soon realized he could not do so. Nietzsche attempted to persuade his classmates to reduce smoking and drinking in social gatherings and move towards a more noble life, but his efforts were rejected. After being coldly rejected, Nietzsche was excluded from the association, feeling lonely and angry. He threw himself into studying linguistics and abandoned his theological studies, becoming deeply immersed in the beauty of ancient Greek literature. Eventually, Nietzsche decided to abstain from futile pleasures for a year, returning to a more ordinary and uneventful life. Nietzsche's studies began to bear fruit, and he was now capable of writing rigorous, insightful papers that were well received by his professors. However, he still felt out of place compared to his peers. He showed no interest in their thoughts or knowledge. He viewed the forces of beauty, goodness, and heroism as ideals, hoping to achieve them. He had never desired a comfortable and easy life, so he had no interest in the happiness of the average person. Nietzsche ultimately could not tolerate his life in Bonn and, before completing his studies, chose to leave. He described his departure from Bonn, saying, "As I was about to leave this beautiful, bustling place and those young classmates, I felt not the slightest bit of pain. Quite the opposite, I was escaping from them. I didn't want to pass judgment on them as I had before. But because my nature was at odds with theirs, so shy and introverted, and in the face of so many external pressures, I lacked the strength to stick to my own choices. Everything was imposed on me, and I could not successfully control the environment I was in." Nietzsche left Bonn and moved to Leipzig, a city located in eastern Germany. The day he arrived was a holiday. The university president told them that on the same day, 100 years earlier, Goethe had registered at this university. However, the president added, "Genius follows its own path, and it is dangerous to follow the paths of geniuses. Goethe was not a good student, so do not model yourselves after him during your studies." This remark seemed more like a subtle reminder to Nietzsche, telling him that aspiring to become a genius is a lonely and miserable journey. At university, Nietzsche came across a book that would significantly influence his thinking for the rest of his life: Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation. Though Nietzsche was unfamiliar with Schopenhauer's name, he was deeply moved by the eloquence of the author's language. He spent 2 weeks immersed in the book. From then on, this powerful yet gloomy masterpiece became deeply embedded in the young Nietzsche's mind. For 2 whole weeks, Nietzsche was entirely absorbed in books and the piano. His sleep was drastically reduced, often falling asleep at 2 a.m. and waking up at 6 a.m. After reading, he would often fall into deep reflection and write down his thoughts as prayers. His inner world grew richer, and he faced the terrifying truths within himself without fear, because his instincts had been preparing him to accept them. In an early letter to his sister, he wrote, "Are we seeking peace and happiness? No, we are only seeking truth, even though it is evil." Nietzsche acknowledged the gloomy world of Schopenhauer's book, which had been foreshadowed in the works of Aeschylus, Byron, and Goethe, and even touched upon in Christian symbolism. Nietzsche had once feared that his youthful recklessness might lead him into an inescapable hell, but now he faced it courageously, knowing that he was no longer alone, for Schopenhauer was with him. Nietzsche was captivated by Schopenhauer's wisdom, fulfilling his long-standing desire to find a mentor. Although he somewhat obsessively viewed Schopenhauer as a father figure, This title held a sacred meaning for him due to the loss of his own father in childhood. Nietzsche felt deeply immersed in Schopenhauer's teachings, yet he recalled the sadness and regret he had felt when he lost his mentor in high school. The joy of finding a mentor and the sorrow of losing one intertwined in his heart, leaving him in a neurotic state, urgently needing immense effort to return to normal life. During this time, only three things could comfort his emotions: Schopenhauer, Schumann's music, and solitary walks. It was around this time that Nietzsche met his close friend, Overbeck. Nietzsche idolized Overbeck, and the two young men gathered together every evening, either walking or riding horses while engaging in deep discussions and debates. They learned from and tolerated one another, and this companionship brought Nietzsche happiness. In 1867, at the age of 23, with Prussia expanding its military and recruiting soldiers, Nietzsche was enlisted and joined an artillery regiment stationed in Naumburg. At first, he was very excited about the experience of becoming a soldier, but it wasn't long before he realized that he preferred literature and contemplation, feeling sorrowful about his situation. However, a fall from his horse led to an injury, allowing him to leave the military and return to university. Although Nietzsche was only 23 and had not yet graduated, his future seemed bright. A prominent literary magazine in Berlin commissioned him to write, and a music review magazine in Leipzig invited him to become an editor. Ultimately, Nietzsche accepted the offer from the Berlin publication. The following year, his professor, Ritschl, asked him a surprising question: "Would you like to become a professor at the University of Basel?" At the time, Nietzsche was only 24 years old and had not yet graduated. It turned out that one of Nietzsche's essays in the literary magazine had caught the attention of Basel University, and the institution had inquired with his professor about whether the author was qualified to teach linguistics at the university. Ritschl had replied to Basel University, stating that Nietzsche was a highly gifted young man and could certainly handle the position. That year, without any exams, the professors at Leipzig University allowed this future colleague of Basel University to graduate. The genius young man was about to bid farewell to his student life and begin a new chapter. Upon arriving at Basel University, Nietzsche first visited the colleagues he would be working with. However, what he most wanted to do was visit the renowned musician Wagner, whom he had greatly admired during his student years. Wagner, who had been fighting against a numb public with his operas and writings, was the person Nietzsche had long wanted to meet, someone who could inspire him like a teacher and help him grow. Less than a month after arriving in Basel, Nietzsche visited the opera master, who was over 30 years older than him. The two had a lively conversation, and after the meeting, they took a walk by the river and continued their discussion. After this first encounter, Nietzsche was completely captivated by Wagner's personal charm, and he decided to join Wagner's crusade to awaken the masses and even resist the German Academy and Church. Wagner, too, was drawn to this young man, someone with extraordinary talent, willing not only to listen to his ideas, but also to provide spiritual feedback. Despite facing much personal criticism, Wagner still had many followers. Soon after, Nietzsche delivered his first lecture at Basel University. He had prepared extensively for this presentation, choosing the topic of Homeric style. The subject involved analyzing the differences between ancient scholars and artists who admired Homer's works. Nietzsche argued that artists' judgments have a degree of objectivity, and scholars must accept these judgments to resolve the divide. The lecture was a success, attracting many listeners eager to hear the young genius share his ideas. This lecture also earned Nietzsche widespread recognition. Wagner praised the young man, and from then on, Nietzsche became a regular guest at Wagner's home. Wagner shared his views on society with Nietzsche, and through these exchanges, Nietzsche deepened his reflections on art and philosophy. During this period, Nietzsche taught at Basel University during weekdays, where he was beloved by his students and had good relationships with his colleagues. On weekends, he visited Wagner to enjoy intellectual discussions in a mentor-mentee setting. He also assisted Wagner with the creation of his operas. These were the most pleasant times of Nietzsche's life. In March of the following year, Nietzsche was formally appointed professor. He was very pleased with this honor and threw himself fully into his work. However, his workload grew increasingly demanding, and 3 months later, exhaustion took its toll on his health, forcing him to take a break. During his rest, he heard shocking news. Prussia had declared war on France. Initially, Nietzsche was concerned with how the war would impact the already mundane and tedious cultural landscape. However, he soon saw that while Prussia, as Germany's core force, won early battles, they suffered tremendous casualties. Though Nietzsche had gained Swiss citizenship due to his position at Basel, his patriotic feelings surged. He applied to the Swiss authorities, hoping to join the fight in support of Prussia. Thus, Nietzsche joined the Swiss Field Medical Corps to provide battlefield treatment for Prussia. They arrived at a large field hospital, where casualties from various fronts were gathered. Due to the large number of wounded, many patients could not receive timely care and had to wait to die from their injuries and diseases. The authorities assigned some of the unfortunate patients to Nietzsche's care, and he worked diligently and courageously. In his work, he experienced a unique sense of reverence. Caring for the wounded gave him a sacred feeling, and the wartime atmosphere invigorated him. This was the first time in his life that he viewed the common people without disdain. These men, some already struck down, awaited death, while others prepared to march back into battle. Nietzsche respected these brave soldiers, caring for them carefully and following their fate. Under the looming threat of war, they all carried a sense of sacrifice for the country, forgetting their own thoughts and marching forward, singing, obeying orders, and dying. Nietzsche's pain from not being able to fight was compensated by the camaraderie he found among the wounded. This emotional connection lifted his spirits and made him feel a deep resonance. He also received an order to escort the wounded to the Karlsruhe hospital. To avoid the cold and rain outside, he and 11 others were locked inside a truck for 3 days and nights. Among the wounded, 2 contracted diphtheria, and the rest suffered from dysentery. During the journey, Nietzsche recalled a favorite motto from a German mystic: "To reach truth, one must first travel the most dangerous road." He dressed the wounds of the injured and listened to their complaints about life and calls for peace. During this time, he continued his reflections, realizing that before the war, his mind was full of books, but now he had learned about life. He savored the painful ordeal, finding a distant beauty in it. He wrote, "I too have my own desires, and thanks to them, I am able to continue my reflections. Now, I am in an extreme and terrifying environment. I recall the nights I spent in the truck with the wounded. It was so lonely, and in the silence of those nights, I explored the 3 abysses of tragedy: imagination, will, and suffering. How did I come to this confident conclusion?" They finally reached their destination safely. However, Nietzsche contracted dysentery and diphtheria from the wounded. An anonymous colleague at the field hospital cared for him carefully, and once his health improved, Nietzsche returned to his home in Naumburg to continue his recovery. After the trials of war, Nietzsche's inner world was transformed. He was no longer the naive person he once was. He had integrated with the masses and felt immense pride in his homeland. War changed him, and he developed a deep respect for it. War awakened people's latent vitality and stirred their dormant souls. In the order of ideals, people sought a harmony between beauty and responsibility, striving to find a new path beyond the cruel outcomes. Lyric poets and philosophers are often misunderstood during times of peace, but are fervently welcomed in times of war. People recognized their importance and urgently needed their voices. At this point, they needed both leaders and longed for genius. Under the pressure of war, human nature was refined, becoming truly brave and noble. During the 2 months of rest at home, Nietzsche continued to reflect on his work regarding the tragic hero. When the news came that the French elite troops had been captured during the Franco-Prussian War, it was a comforting message for the Prussians and Germans. However, Nietzsche felt neither joy nor comfort. Instead, he was filled with disgust and fear, as he sensed a wave of excitement, pride, and arrogance spreading among the people. Then Wagner's article on Beethoven's 100th birthday deeply moved Nietzsche, especially the line, "Germans, you are naturally brave, but please remain brave even in times of peace." Nietzsche's longing for his mentor, Wagner, surged again. despite still not fully recovered. He left home and traveled back to Switzerland to visit him. However, this meeting left Nietzsche somewhat disappointed. He realized that Wagner had gradually lost the spiritual heights he once had during times of adversity. He had become vulgar, praising Prussia and contemptuously criticizing France. Yet, this was also a chance encounter that introduced Nietzsche to a kindred spirit, a historian named Burckhardt. Burckhardt listened attentively to Nietzsche's complaints, and the two found a bond. They often had intellectual debates, especially on culture and beauty, but their disagreements didn't hinder their ongoing friendship. For a long time, Nietzsche couldn't recover from the hardships of war. Sleep no longer obeyed him. In February of the following year, his nervous system began to collapse, and the symptoms appeared acutely. Intense neuralgia, insomnia, eye disease, stomach issues, and jaundice, all tormenting him for 5 months. Nietzsche called his sister back and then set off for Lugano. Back then, travelers could only cross the St. Gotthard Mountains by carriage. His companion was a simple, humorous, and quite unusual man named Mazzini. The two got along very well. Mazzini quoted a proverb, "In the middle of a suffocating breath, live steadfastly in the whole, the entirety and beauty." Nietzsche never forgot the person who transmitted this saying or the healthy, brief trip they shared. The enjoyable journey was beneficial to Nietzsche's health. By the time Nietzsche arrived in Lugano, he had fully recovered. His mood was still gentle, and he began to glow with vitality once again. His joyful passion reignited. In April, Nietzsche returned to his work at the university, continuing his teaching and research. On weekends, he would visit Wagner's home. However, he soon realized that since Germany's victory, many strangers had flooded into Wagner's house. Wagner believed that the victory was the best opportunity to awaken the Germans. But Nietzsche, with his solitary soul, grew increasingly disturbed by this new circle, feeling disillusioned by the ideas discussed. He no longer saw Wagner as the hero he once admired. At this time, Nietzsche also faced a major frustration. His completed work, The Birth of Tragedy, could not find a publisher for several months. The guarantees in his manuscript didn't satisfy the publisher's requirements, and in the end, he had to rely on a publisher recommended by Wagner to get the book published. On the last day of 1871, The Birth of Tragedy was finally published. Upon its release, it was praised by Wagner and his friends. Nietzsche then planned his next move. He wanted to give lectures on the book's content and published the lecture notes. However, the reality was unexpected. Almost no one, except for Nietzsche's mentors and friends, bought or read the book, and no newspapers or magazines took note of its publication. To his surprise, Nietzsche received harsh criticism when he wrote to the renowned linguist Richard Wagner, hoping for feedback. Clearly, Nietzsche was not prepared for failure. When the blow came, he was anxious and shocked. He developed laryngitis, which prevented him from giving his lectures and left him resting at home. At the same time, Wagner was preparing to leave, moving his family to Bayreuth, where he intended to fulfill his dream of building a theater. Although Nietzsche attended the grand opening of the theater and felt excited for Wagner, he felt a deep unease. The Wagner he now saw was no longer the serious and pure hero he had once admired. Instead, he appeared as a rugged worker, filled with traits of barbarism, resentment, and jealousy. Nietzsche planned to go to northern Germany to give lectures, write, and create alliances, but Wagner rejected this idea. He insisted that Nietzsche give a lecture titled "The Future of Our Educational Institutions." Nietzsche sensed a selfish motive behind Wagner's request and refused. Wagner, angered, repeatedly told Nietzsche, "Our proud Nietzsche only wants to do what he is willing to do." Wagner's anger left Nietzsche feeling both sad and ashamed. He had never imagined that his mentor would be like this. He thought to himself, always using illness and work pressure as an excuse. Do I have no right to be respected? Do I not have freedom? Must I always obey others' commands? Why is Wagner so authoritarian and unreasonable? Nietzsche wrote in his journal, "Wagner lacks the strength to make those around him free and great. Wagner is not loyal. Instead, he is suspicious and arrogant." After a period of busy work, Nietzsche's health began to deteriorate again. He developed severe insomnia and had to stop working to rest. He decided to relax through travel once more. He spent a few pleasant days at a mountain inn in Italy, enjoying the fresh air and reflecting in solitude. After the brief relaxation, he returned to Basel, the city where he worked, and gradually began to grow fond of it. However, this return marked a low point in his life. Upon returning, for reasons unknown to him, the 20 students he was responsible for gradually transferred to other professors, leaving him with only 2 students, one studying German, the other studying law. Meanwhile, German linguists collectively rejected him, personally attacked him, declared that his research was dead, and forbade him from lecturing. At the age of 28, Nietzsche found himself isolated by the academic community. Despite this, Nietzsche was not defeated. He wrote, "We must hold on to our belief in courage. Dear friend, I have always had faith in the path ahead of us. I firmly believe that we will remain loyal to our ambitions and strengthen our power. I am confident that when we succeed, we will find even further goals and face the future with more vigor. Yes, we will reach our destination. As conquerors, we will then discover even farther goals and continue to move forward. Few will be the spectators who watch us move ahead, but that will not stop us from pressing forward. But if these people are qualified to critique us, then these few spectators are enough." No matter how his peers evaluated or isolated him, Nietzsche continued to work tirelessly, delving deeper into the philosophy of ancient Greek tragedies, immersing himself in the world of his own philosophical reflections. However, just as he felt he was close to finding the final answer to his thoughts during this stage, his overthinking led him back into the torment of headaches, eye pain, and stomach issues. By this time, his eyes could no longer tolerate any light, and he was unable to read. He could only continue his research through his thoughts. After a long period of time, these pains gradually began to subside. The following year, Nietzsche completed his paper on Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, and organized his thought manuscripts into a pamphlet reflecting on German contemporary thought. The pamphlet sparked widespread discussion, and aside from Nietzsche's friends and a few older critics who praised the work highly, most of the reactions were far from friendly. In the pamphlet, Nietzsche wrote, "The German spirit is heading towards destruction in the hands of the German Empire." This nation had just unified Germany through the Franco-Prussian War, and the newly established German Empire was basking in the taste of conquest. Nietzsche's words deeply offended them. As a result, Nietzsche faced much insult and crude criticism, with some even labeling him a traitor. However, Nietzsche was not surprised by the public's reaction. Instead, he felt exhilarated and decided to engage society with the attitude of a duelist. He prepared to publish over 20 papers and dive into debates with his opponents. In 1874, at the age of 30, Nietzsche published a pamphlet on the use and abuse of history. In it, he directed his criticism squarely at the modern man's pride, science, and history. Nietzsche wrote, "In my ideal kingdom, I would rid the world of those who claim to be cultured, just as Plato expelled the poets." In this blunt statement, Nietzsche humiliated thousands of professors, people who held the power to shape public discourse. They all rejected Nietzsche, with none willing to mention his works. Over the next few years, Nietzsche continued organizing his untimely thoughts, hoping to gradually refine them while also battling his illness. His eyes hurt, his vision was poor, and his work was often interrupted by sickness. But his thoughts kept running. There were brief moments of rest, during which he would travel to clear his mind. Nietzsche released Human, All Too Human, and Parables in pamphlet form, and the criticism and schadenfreude he received far outweighed any praise. In particular, Human, All Too Human was reviewed, though reviewed is perhaps too mild a term, by the magazine bestseller in what could only be called a condemnation. An anonymous writer in the magazine said, "German professors spend their whole lives writing a book to help them gain reputation. But that doesn't mean they discover truth everywhere. Some are content to grab attention by proving the errors of others. And when these disgraced predecessors are already famous, this effect becomes even more apparent." Nietzsche recognized the anonymous author as his former idol, Wagner. Such lowly criticism caused Nietzsche great pain, and his break with his former mentor was a source of long-lasting suffering. At the age of 35, Nietzsche published the sequel to Human, All Too Human, titled Disordered Thoughts and Aphorisms. However, this second installment attracted far fewer criticisms. Was this because people had begun to accept Nietzsche? Rather than acceptance, it seemed more like sympathy. Nietzsche's health was rapidly deteriorating, and he was tortured daily by headaches, stomach problems, and eye troubles. Even the doctors were anxious, unable to diagnose his symptoms or cure his afflictions. To the doctors, his illness seemed to be threatening both his life and his sanity. Nietzsche, intuitively, also sensed their fear. His sister rushed to his side, and upon seeing him, she almost did not recognize him. The once lively figure had now aged 10 years in one, frail and hunched. At this point, Nietzsche was unable to speak and could only gesture to express his gratitude for her presence. That year, at 35, Nietzsche gave up his professorship. His resignation was accepted, and the university granted him a pension of 3,000 francs. Nietzsche, sensing that recovery was beyond reach, confided in his sister his final wish: "Promise me that only my friends will watch over my body. Drive away those casual acquaintances and curious onlookers, for I cannot protect myself from them. Do not let any priests or others speak insincerely over my body. Do not bury me as a loyal, never-lying heretic." Nietzsche longed to spend his remaining years alone in the quietest, most remote place. His sister took him to the Engadine Valley in Switzerland, a place devoid of people, where Nietzsche unexpectedly found comfort. The fresh, pure air, the soft, pleasant light over the meadows, and the scattered lakes brought him solace, allowing him to enjoy the beautiful villages and kind farmers around him. Nietzsche stayed in Engadine until early September. Despite the harsh conditions and the lack of friends, books and music still provided him with fulfillment. Though he was filled with doubts, he was not consumed by pain. Instead, he immersed himself in the recording of his thoughts. He had no illusions about recovering from his illness, realizing that the current respite was only temporary and that hope was futile. Nevertheless, he savored the moment, experiencing a last bit of happiness as he could still reflect on things, human nature, the mountains, and the sky, embracing the fleeting joy of those last days. Sensing his time was running out, Nietzsche decided to return to his hometown of Naumburg for a peaceful life. He hoped physical labor would help distract his thoughts and rented a large house in an ancient castle. The castle's high, thick walls surrounded a large yard. Nietzsche rented part of the land to plant fruit trees, roses, lilacs, and other plants, with plans to plant vegetables the following spring. However, the harsh winter climate in Naumburg, with its glaring snow and damp air, was a challenge for his weakened body. In just a few weeks, he was unable to adjust to the environment, and his health deteriorated again, erasing the temporary improvement he had experienced in Engadine. Though Nietzsche felt the threat of death and endured immense pain, he viewed the suffering as a test, a trial to strengthen his will, and eventually he accepted it. Nietzsche compared his fate to that of great figures like Leo Batty, who succumbed to illness, while he found truth in his suffering. "The sick have no right to become pessimists," he declared. It was this unyielding willpower that ultimately allowed Nietzsche to survive. The snow, which had once blurred his vision, melted away, and he noticed his health improving. Nietzsche greatly cherished his regained health, feeling astonished by each day of wellness. Every morning, he jumped out of bed, dressed, and packed his pockets with notes, a book, some fruit, and bread before setting off. He wrote, "As soon as the sun rises, I head to the shore. I find a quiet rock by the waves, set up an umbrella, and lie motionless like a lizard on the stone. In front of me, there is only the sea and the pure sky, nothing else." He would spend hours there, often until the last light of dusk. His frail eyes suited these moments, as they were sensitive to light and often hurt in its presence. So, to enjoy this brief joy was, for Nietzsche, a happiness in itself. He wrote, "The sea here makes us forget the city. At the hour of prayer, the city's bells still toll. The sound is so sorrowful, foolish, and sweet at dusk. In a minute, the whole world will become silent, and the vast sea will stretch, pale and glowing, silent as ever. The evening is deeply silent, and the sky shines with radiant colors, reds, yellows, and greens, shifting endlessly. It is a sight so awe-inspiring, conquering us in a flash, making our hearts swell. In 1881, at the age of 37, Nietzsche completed another work he hoped would amaze his friends. However, after the publishers read the manuscript, they still did not understand it. Nietzsche waited from January until July before it was published, and he finally named it Dawn. Like his previous works, Dawn failed. The critics paid no attention, and even his friends found it hard to understand, which left Nietzsche deeply melancholic. But slowly, he regained his resolve. His friend Paul visited, and Nietzsche took him to his favorite walking spots, showing him the rocky streams. These were the places where, in a letter to Gast, he had happily mentioned, "One day, about 600 or 1,000 years from now, people will erect a statue of the author of Dawn near that rock." In 1882, at just shy of 38, Nietzsche received a letter from his friend Messenberg, asking him to visit Rome. At that time, Nietzsche and his friend Paul were traveling, and on their return journey, they happened to pass through Rome. Nietzsche agreed to go, and it was during this trip that he experienced his dramatic love story. Messenberg introduced Nietzsche to a young Russian woman named Salome, who was not yet 20 years old. Before their meeting, Messenberg had told Salome, "Nietzsche is a man who would sacrifice everything for freedom." He also told Nietzsche about Salome, saying, "She is a witty, brave, strong-minded girl with a natural, straightforward character." When Nietzsche first met Salome, he was captivated by her charm, drawn to her calm expression, confident, and graceful demeanor. However, Salome did not immediately feel the same way. Though she sensed the unique aura of Nietzsche, she remained calm and observed the man who was nearly 20 years her senior. A few days after their meeting, Salome and her mother were about to leave Rome, and Nietzsche and Paul, the two philosophers, accompanied them. Unexpectedly, both men fell for Salome. Nietzsche said to Paul, "Such a wonderful girl, you should marry her." Paul replied, "No, I adhere to pessimistic philosophy. The mundane matters of having children and a family disgust me." At this point, Nietzsche even urged Paul to reconsider, saying, "I too once thought of avoiding marriage, but my views have changed now." The four of them passed through Lucerne and stopped there. Nietzsche decided to take Salome to visit Tripschen, the place where he had once met his idol, the teacher Wagner. In the garden, tall white poplars surrounded him, reminding him of the unforgettable times, which were filled with both joy and Wagner's grand performances. Faced with these happy memories, Nietzsche felt pain. He turned his face away, so Salome wouldn't see his expression. Suddenly, he fell silent, staring at the young woman, and tears began to fall from his eyes. Nietzsche did not hide his deep affection for this new friend and shared with her the experiences of his life over the decades. His childhood shadows, his father, who died young, the hardships of being a pastor's son, and the mysterious fate he had encountered. He spoke of his deep devotion to religion, the fear of a godless world, his meeting with Schopenhauer and Wagner, and the terror he felt after abandoning his belief in God. He told Salome, "Yes, I started taking risks then, and I haven't stopped. I'll continue moving forward, wondering if I will ever find a new faith." Nietzsche solemnly added, "At least that seems more meaningful than standing still, reminiscing about past possibilities." Although Nietzsche didn't express his love to this captivating woman, the power of love deeply affected him, and he felt helpless against it. Afraid of confessing directly, he asked his friend Paul to convey his feelings for him. Nietzsche, who was nearing 40, left early, seemingly due to shyness. At that moment, Nietzsche felt that Salome's presence brought him a happiness he had never known and made his thoughts more alive. However, his rational thoughts, rooted in disdain for the mundane nature of procreation, told him not to marry. But his heart told him he wanted to marry Salome, even if it were just a spiritual union. He had already imagined the result of their spiritual connection, spiritual children, like Zarathustra. Eventually, Nietzsche received Salome's reply. She didn't want to marry, as she had just emerged from a failed relationship and wasn't ready to fall in love again. Though she rejected Nietzsche's proposal, she kindly suggested building a friendship and spiritual connection with him. Nietzsche immediately returned to Lucerne, attempting to persuade Salome to change her mind, but she remained firm in her refusal. In July, Salome planned to attend a concert in Bayreuth organized by Wagner, and Nietzsche advised her not to go. But no matter how much Nietzsche tried to convince her, Salome insisted on attending the concert, promising to meet him afterward and spend a few weeks together. In the end, Nietzsche accepted her condition and embraced this limited friendship. During this time, driven by love, Nietzsche's creative thinking shifted. He quickly wrote The Gay Science, a booklet of aphorisms, and handed it over to the publisher. However, as usual, the booklet was met with some picky criticisms. Though Nietzsche graciously accepted the critiques, he couldn't accept the suggestion that his work was without value. After Salome returned from the music festival in Bayreuth, she reunited with Nietzsche. Salome told Nietzsche how she had seen the tragic history of humanity in Wagner's mysterious dramas as a continuous trial. Nietzsche, however, spoke of a different kind of mysterious drama, that of our lives and fate itself. Salome sympathized with the pain Nietzsche had endured. She gave him a short poem, like the deep love between friends, I love you. Life is so wonderful. Because of you, I have wept and laughed, sharing my emotions with you. My feelings contain both joy and sorrow. I love you. If you must destroy me, I will leave in pain, like a friend breaking free from another's embrace. I will give all my strength to love you. Can you not give me other joys? Yet, I still share the pain with you. Nietzsche was deeply moved by this gift and broke his 8-year-long ban on composing music. He set the poem to music, composing a piece full of sorrow and longing, and sent it to Salome. After their reunion, Salome returned home, and she and Nietzsche continued communicating through letters. Nietzsche shared his work, plans, and research with her, everything about his life. However, 2 months later, Salome came to visit Nietzsche, but she wasn't alone. She had 2 others with her. On their first meeting, Nietzsche's friend Paul was with her. Perhaps by now, we can guess what happened. It was clear that Salome wanted Nietzsche to understand that their relationship was based on a friendship that resonated emotionally, but she did not wish to offer loyalty in a rational sense. We can't know for sure what Salome truly thought, but her actions seemed to yield to a certain unconscious nature, trying to keep both men close to her. This situation, however, pushed Nietzsche mentally into a dark abyss. He felt betrayed by the woman he once loved and by what he had believed to be his closest friend over the past 8 years. Faced with this painful situation, Nietzsche, lacking experience, was lost and unsure of how to respond. Nietzsche's sister, pretending to write on his behalf, sent Salome an accusatory letter filled with insults, which led to their complete break. Nietzsche, feeling utterly despondent, fled Leipzig, the city that was filled with painful memories. Nietzsche arrived in Rapallo, a scenic but sparsely populated coastal town, where he spent 5 winters. He hoped that the beautiful scenery would suppress his painful memories. It was during these 5 years that Nietzsche began and completed his most influential work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It was also during this time that Wagner, the teacher Nietzsche had once idolized but later parted ways with, passed away, which deeply saddened him. He had not corresponded with his former mentor for 6 years, but now he wrote a letter to Wagner's lover, saying, "The past is now deeply buried in my heart, and the death of my teacher has deeply grieved me." At this time, Nietzsche had other troubles. The publisher still hadn't printed Thus Spoke Zarathustra. After several inquiries, he was told, "We must first print 500,000 copies of a hymnal for schools." Nietzsche had no choice but to continue waiting. Weeks later, he inquired again, only to receive another excuse. "After the hymnal, we have a large number of anti-Semitic pamphlets to print, so your book will be delayed." As June approached, Thus Spoke Zarathustra still had no release date. Friedrich Nietzsche became enraged. He was anguished for his hero, who was being obstructed by the cliches of religious and anti-Semitic rhetoric. Finally, the booklet was published in June, after Nietzsche personally funded its release. But like almost all of Nietzsche's works, it was ignored, belittled, and mocked. Only 40 copies were sold, 7 of which were given to friends, and only one person thanked him. No one praised the book, no one recognized it, and Nietzsche continued to work in solitude. In the following 3 years, he traveled through several cities and eventually completed the 2nd through 4th parts of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In 1886, at the age of 42, Nietzsche completed a new work, Beyond Good and Evil. In the past, he would have felt immense joy and confidence upon finishing a complete work. But now, both his happiness and confidence had vanished without a trace. He knew that no one would read his book. The bad luck people encounter is always worse than they could have imagined. In fact, it got even worse. He couldn't even find a publisher willing to publish Beyond Good and Evil. Publishers in Leipzig rejected him, and so did those in Berlin. The book was being rejected everywhere, and Nietzsche feared it might never be published. With one last hope, he sent the manuscript to 2 friends abroad, hoping they could help, though it was a faint hope, and he had to put the manuscript aside. In 1888, at just 44 years old, Nietzsche wrote, "Life has never been as difficult for me as it is today. I can no longer maintain a healthy relationship with reality. If I cannot forget them, I will be torn apart by them. Once I fall into sorrow, I am left with nothing but endless darkness. I have so many things to do, everything to do, so I must endure. Every morning, I must remind myself to live well." This philosopher, who had long delved into the deepest fates of humanity, was under immense pressure. During this time, bizarre thoughts flooded his mind, and he constantly thought about how others had deprived him of love and friendship. His brain had begun to experience various hallucinations. On April 6, 1888, Nietzsche arrived in Turin, an ancient city in Italy. This city sparked a period of prolific creativity for Nietzsche, but also marked the end of his creative inspiration. That year, in August, he completed the Wagner case and the Birth of Tragedy. In September, he finished Twilight of the Idols and the Antichrist. In November, he wrote Ecce Homo, and in December, Nietzsche versus Wagner. At this point, it seemed that the mental block that had been holding him back had lifted, and all of his previously suppressed thoughts began to pour out. His works became groundbreaking, profound, yet filled with unheard of aggressiveness and shocking self-aggrandizement. From this year on, Nietzsche had lost control of himself. Some may have thought that Nietzsche had gone mad, and perhaps they were right, as no one could make a definitive judgment. However, Nietzsche still retained his ability to think and was able to control himself to some extent. But by 1888, at the age of 44, even this ability vanished. Nonetheless, his talent remained, and his writing was sharp, incisive. He felt extremely lucid, but this clarity was a disaster for him, as it hastened his destruction. On New Year's Day, 1889, Nietzsche had just turned 44 and hadn't even reached his 45th birthday when, on January 3rd, he went out. During his time in Turin, he often took walks alone, but little did he know that this would be the last time he would go out like an adult. From that point on, he would return, but only as a child, led by others. There are 2 versions of the incident that marked Nietzsche's complete breakdown. One version claims that he had a confrontation with a policeman in the street, which triggered a breakdown. The more widely known version is the Turin horse incident. The story of the Turin horse goes like this. On January 3rd, Nietzsche was aimlessly walking around the square. By this time, he had shed all the tears he would ever shed. A man of iron will, he had nothing left to fear or sorrow over. However, Nietzsche was also more fragile than anyone could imagine. That day, there was a farmer mercilessly whipping his old horse. The horse's screams echoed across the square, but everyone was too busy with their own affairs to notice the agony of the animal. Nietzsche, the philosopher, or perhaps the madman, happened to wander by the square. The sound of the horse's shrieks, the cries as the whip struck its body, hammered into Nietzsche's heart like a nail. The pain of the horse became one with his own suffering. Each lash of the whip felt like a sharp knife cutting through his heart. Every scream from the horse destroyed what was left of Nietzsche's healthy nerves. As the horse howled, Nietzsche felt the terror of being brain split. The farmer's strikes were like those that bound Prometheus to the Caucasus, his liver being devoured by the eagle, as he suffered endless agony for giving fire and light to humanity. Nietzsche, too, was destroyed by the horse's cries. "My suffering brother," he whispered. Nietzsche rushed to the horse, embracing its neck. Tears flowed freely as the two became one, a statue of life refusing to be tainted by suffering. Under the astonished gaze of the farmer and those around them, the horse, breathing heavily and shedding tears, seemed to say, "Brother, my brother." Of course, the onlookers didn't understand, but by then, Nietzsche was already mad. The mad can hear what others cannot, right? Nietzsche had lost it. From that moment on, people began to point at him, whispering, "Look at that madman, he's hugging a horse and crying. Ha ha ha." The crowd grew larger, and eventually, the police arrived. Nietzsche's landlord, David Fino, also came, and together, they led Nietzsche back to the hotel. From that point on, the philosopher Nietzsche was gone, and the fate of the horse remains unknown. 5 days later, on January 8th, Nietzsche's friend Overbeck rushed to see him. He couldn't accept what he saw. Overbeck took Nietzsche to a mental hospital in Basel, where Dr. Weiler examined him. Apart from the usual case report, the doctor noted that one of Nietzsche's symptoms was the desire to kiss and embrace every passerby in the street. At 44, Nietzsche was cared for by his mother and sister. He remained in this state until his death in 1900, just shy of his 56th birthday. During this time, no one could cure him, and Nietzsche no longer had to bear the burden of thought. Perhaps Nietzsche had simply moved on to a better place, somewhere unknown to us, and this great man, who had contributed so much to humanity's understanding of the world, could finally rest. Ironically, after Nietzsche's madness began, his work suddenly gained recognition from philosophers and linguists. A literary essay from 1902 described the growing Nietzsche craze. Nietzsche himself became a myth, a hero, and a founder. People flocked to him, worshipped him, and sang praises in his name. From the onset of his mental breakdown in 1889 until his death in 1900, Nietzsche became the unquestionable spiritual icon of the turn of the century in Germany and Austria. Thus, the story of Nietzsche ended. A man with a rich inner world, but profound loneliness left us, like a shooting star across the sky, seemingly tearing apart the darkness. Like many philosophers, Nietzsche was a flash of lightning in the vast universe. Wherever that lightning struck, the darkness lightened a little. But Nietzsche was different. He urged us to transcend ourselves, to go beyond our own limitations. For over a century, every philosopher who read Nietzsche's works could not escape his influence. Having listened to Nietzsche's life story, may you, as Nietzsche hoped, become someone who transcends yourself. But may you also avoid the endless loneliness that Nietzsche endured.